What if you could look inside the timeline of a top Hollywood editor and compare it directly to how an indie film is actually cut? Not theory, actual timelines. Well, a few years ago, Eddie Hamilton, the editor of Top Gun, Maverick, and the Mission Impossible films, shared a full breakdown of his editing timeline.
What you can see in front of you is the complete timeline of the entire movie, reels 1 to 7.
It's a rare look at how editing works at the highest level. In this video, I'll walk you through key elements of Eddie's timeline.
We break the film up into roughly 2,000-foot reels.
And then show you how I handle similar challenges in my own projects. He says it's about 20 minutes. Reel 2 for us is actually much bigger. Highlight what's different and what actually translates across both worlds. Because once you see both, you start to understand something much more useful than just how to organize tracks.
In order to keep the chunks of action manageable, and it also allows my team to work on other bits of the movie.
It's about how your timeline supports your workflow, how it impacts collaboration with the other departments, and how it ultimately affects the way you shape a scene. By the end of this, you'll have a clear sense of how you can build a system that works for you. All of this in this video. So now we're gonna look at Eddie Hamilton's timeline and we're gonna compare it to my own. So at the beginning, he's talking about the entire timeline. The whole movie is in one timeline. You can see it right here and it's massive.
Mav, can we outrun these guys?
Not their missiles and guns.
Then it's a dogfight.
What you can see in front of you is the complete timeline of the entire movie, reels 1 to 7. And what you'll notice here is you can easily see where the flight sequences are, because they're really teeny tiny little bits of dialogue and action all kind of squeezed together in lots of short cuts.
So you can see this is one of the flight sequences here. There's another one. And this is much faster cut than the rest of the movie. But again, you're seeing the whole timeline here built in one thing. And this is important to know because as a next step, he's actually talking about how he's going to break up the movie into reels, in chunks. We kind of do the same thing. And before I show it to you, let's just talk about what a reel is and why he's using reels to break up the movie.
So when we work on these large movies, we break the film up into roughly what used to be 2,000-foot reels of 35mm film, which was about 20 minutes of screen time. So we still do that in the Avid Media Composer in order to keep the chunks of action manageable, and it also allows my team to work on other bits of the movie while I'm working on one separate piece of the movie.
So they're breaking up the movie into chunks. We do the same thing in the indie world. And let me just bring up my timeline right here. And you see this is reel 2 right there. He says it's about 20 minutes. Reel 2 for us is actually much bigger. It's gonna be 35 minutes. And that just has to do with the fact that reel 2 actually represents one specific part of the film. It's kind of the act 2, all the explanation, all the setup, all that. And it just needed to stay together. And that's why it's a little longer. Our reel 1 is actually only 10 minutes long. The reason why we did it this way is because it just story-wise makes more sense to keep the reels at a certain length, but we still work with reels. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, we have 5 reels that we work at. And each one of them, a different editor. I co-edited this film with my friend Dustin Hughes. And right now the film is done, so he's not in the project at all. But he could potentially be in reel 4 or 3, working while I'm in reel 1 and 2. I just wanted to mention quickly, we also have a master where we put everything together. But it's actually just outputs of the individual reels. So this is reel 1, reel 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're offline because this is actually the finished version, color corrected everything in the online, and I never actually get a version of that on my system because my job is done at this point. I've logged picture, we delivered the film, and then it goes into online. Dustin has a version because he oversaw the delivery, and I had to actually jump onto another project on my end. It just worked out that way. Okay, so let's continue on with how Eddie explains the reels. So that's takeaway number one. Work your film in Reels makes it really easy to work with other people as well as other departments.
We may have finished kind of like the middle section of the movie, so we can turn over, say, Reels 2, 3, 4, and 5, and I'm still working on Reel 1 and Reel 6 and 7.
So again, we're basically doing the same thing here.
So we're looking at Reel 1 now, and you'll notice that the top few tracks, there's a TC1 track there, which basically splits the audio and the video. It's quite common for editors to do this.
This is TC1, and this is actually just a timecode track. And this is something that's very specific to Avid. He cuts in Avid. In Premiere, we don't really have a track for the timecode here. We have this timecode track here to look at, which Avid does as well. When I'm cutting in Avid, I do this as well. It just sort of breaks up these two video versus audio into two very distinct segments.
It's quite common for editors to do this, but you'll see that I've labeled all the tracks, which is very useful. I highly recommend that everyone does that so everyone knows what's supposed to be on what track.
So what he's saying here, he's labeling all the tracks. So V1, that's video layer 1, is drama, which is basically the camera originals, the production. Then visual effects, color, some notes or subtitles, some numbering system for the visual effects. We'll talk about what a 0 version is in a second. And then he has one track here for new shots coming in. So before he puts them down here, they arrive here, the assistant cuts them in, he can review them, and then this is the final pass, everything color corrected, ready to go. How do we do this? We do the same thing. We have video 1. Now, I could call this production as well. He calls it drama, but video 1 is, again, Dustin actually organized all this. Like when I cut, it's kind of a battlefield, to be honest. Let me show you a scene here. This is how I cut. It's quite messy. I have what we would call drama, or what Eddie would call drama, all over the place. With the audio, I mean, I'm pretty good. I keep dialogue up here. Then I have some additional audio here. That's probably the interview. This is a documentary, by the way, but it's not that different from documentary or feature film when it comes to track organization. I could show you a feature that I cut earlier, but it's in Final Cut 10, and Final Cut 10 is its own animal. It doesn't do track-based editing. It has a magnetic timeline. Everything is completely different. My point being is my timeline is quite a battlefield, but if I would be working in a television environment where I have with 7 other editors and I work on one episode, and mostly then there's 2 editors working on the episode plus a supervising editor overseeing the episode, and everything gets fed to the supervising editor, you can't deliver a cut like this. It has to be clean, organized in a way that they don't have to clean up your work. The supervising editor is often the finishing editor of the episode, and they'll do the final polish, the last notes, whatever needs to be done on their own. So let's go back to Eddie.
And the reason I have so many video tracks is so that we can keep track of a lot of things simultaneously. So what you're looking at is the finished timeline of the movie. When I'm starting to assemble and I'm refining the edit, I will normally have a lot of options for each thing stacked up. And so this is a very simplified version of the timeline where we've tidied it up for the purposes of finishing the movie in the DI, in the color grading and the final visual effects. But V1 drama is the original shots straight out of the camera and dropped onto the timeline. And then the next 2 layers above that are visual effects, iterations of shots, and then the final VFX shots are on V4.
He was talking quite a bit about the various tracks, that there's a lot for visual effects. For us, it's probably not as much. I mean, we have quite a bit of visual effects in this show. We have the original here, and then this is the treated shot. So if I go back, this is without.
A significant increase in the number of voters in this.
This is without the graphic, and then our graphics department, and it's Jason who did this.
Decades, there's been a significant increase in the number of voters in this country that are unaffiliated.
Would then create whatever effects he needs to, motion graphics, titles, and give that shot back to us, and that would live here on V2 graphics. We do keep versions as well, but not necessarily in the timeline, which Eddie does. He might have 40 different versions of a visual effect shot, and they are all collapsed into one timeline, kind of like he creates a nest or a compound clip that he has always the option to go back an iteration earlier.
The color is on V5. So sometimes it'll be color effects like you can see there, and sometimes it will be clips that we've got back from the DI, which we will drop in because they're colored. But Joseph Kosinski really works on the color for every screening, and sometimes would actually dive in on the media composer himself and color correct shots.
That's pretty amazing that the director goes into the Avid and does some color correction themselves. Pretty impressive. I haven't had that in quite a while, that a director actually worked in the edit. I had it in television sometimes, but not on feature films.
And then you'll see notes that I've put on V6.
Okay, then after that, he has some form of notes or text, and this is already, again, collapsed. He talks about having 3 different types of notes. So it could be an actual physical title that is in the film. It could be an editing note that he types in where he writes what the visual effect shot is, because sometimes you don't know what it is. Because it's a visual effect and it's treated. He writes that, or it could be an editing note. It also could be a shot number, which is here VFX subcaps. So he goes through the different types of notes that they're doing. This is like an edited notes that he's talking about.
You may not realize what the visual effects are because they're kind of invisible. So the VFX subcaps track is a small subcap that's in the top left corner of the screen where we have a visual representation of every shot number.
They keep track of all the shot numbers. We do something similar in the sense that each shot number has a number here, as well as it says graphic here, version 3, and then what that shot basically is. So there would be a version 2 and a version 1 that was used beforehand. So we'll keep track of these numbers as well. But we don't necessarily have that shot number superimposed onto our film. We do sometimes have this here. So this, for example, just tells us what the scene is, what state, where we are. So every beat in the film has kind of a scene description. We have an additional physical burn into the image. This is actually not really burned in. This is just an overlay in the editing software. When we do an output, this would disappear. But let's say we do an output to the producers and they want to have a timecode reference. We have that option to burn that into the image. Okay, let's go back to Eddie.
And then the version 0 is where the VFX team take our original camera plate and they put it through their color pipeline and their sizing pipeline, and they send it back to us to make sure that what we're getting back is exactly the same as the camera original dailies. So they've taken the color from the dailies, the CDL values, the color decision list values that have been generated by the lab. They've applied them through the VFX pipeline, and they've taken the camera original files and managed to transcode them back so they sit perfectly in the Avid.
Okay, so what he's saying here is you have those visual effects, but the shot that they applied this on may not have been graded correctly yet in the color. So they have to go back to the original, grade it, and then apply the effect again. At least this is how I understand it.
Yeah, we on the way, we came to play.
And we do something very similar. So we have some animations going on like in this shot, and in the background there is a character talking, and this may not be the final grade of this film. So before everything gets finalized, they have to go one more time back and just match the grade up and then re-render this visual effect. The reason why you do it at the end is because obviously it takes a lot of additional processing and time to render these. And first you want to finalize the film, you want to finalize the graphics, make sure everything is timed exactly how it needs to be. And then once it's locked, then you go back and you match everything in terms of the color. This is an interesting thought, and this is something that I haven't really implemented, but I don't really deal with the visual effects that much. But what Eddie is doing here is a really interesting method that I think I would apply as well, which is new shots coming in. They don't get cut into the show directly into whatever layer. They have their own track, and he first approves them, looks at them, and then he will physically move them once everything checks out.
Now, this is crucially important for me. I know that not every editor does this, but I really like to see all the new shots that are going into the movie on a daily basis. So my team will cut any new VFX shots that come in every day onto that track. And then on the reel name in the cutting copy folder, they'll write a little VFX at the end. So I know that VFX shots have been added. And every morning, one of the first things I do is I skip through the V9 track, look at all the shots that have been submitted, and I drop them down into the film. And then I also can write notes for each shot.
Okay, good. So this is what he does. I think this is super helpful to have new shots on its own layer and then move them down once they get approved.
And then finally, Company 3 color there. That's the final graded version of the movie back from Company 3, who did the color on Top Gun Maverick.
So I mentioned earlier the version 0. Version 0 is like getting everything kind of the same grade. The footage that was edited and the visual effects, where maybe they use part of the footage as a camera plate and added visual effects. All that is kind of baseline, the same color, has the same grade. And then final color is when everything is done, they'll put another grade on top of it, which is like the actual look of the film. So the first one is just consistent, it's corrected, it's even, and the last version of that with all the visual effects in there, that's just giving the film a look, giving it a certain mood visually. That's what they're doing. He's talked about all the different video tracks and how they're organized. He talked about how important it is to label them. Now he's going to move on to audio.
So again, it's very important. If you're working on a complex timeline, it really helps to label your tracks. And Avid's been able to do that for quite a few years now. But I remember when I started out, all you had was A1, A2, A3. But the fact that you can label them now is super helpful. So DX dialogue, DX stands for dialogue. So 4 mono tracks there, which is the original production audio.
Okay, so the first 4 tracks, that's the actual dialogue from the set, recorded by the sound department. Then ADR's additional dialogue recording. So this might be stuff that they're recording in a voiceover booth when, for example, the audio wasn't good. Like they were flying around in planes and you hear the engine noises. So you can't really use the sound that was recorded back then, and the actors have to go back in the booth, and then that would be on these tracks.
Come on, man, do some of that pilot shit! Brace yourself! Holy shit!
We have the option too to give these names, but we chose not to. While here we did give the video tracks names, here we just do A1, just a number. But we do have the same thing going on where we have the dialogue first, then we have some sound effects, and then we have music here. Sometimes there is some special treatment here of some audio if we had to clean it up quite a bit. So we used actually some AI software sometimes to clean up if, for example, a mic was out and we only picked up the camera mic, or there was a lot of background noise, or there was music in the background. There's some really nifty tools now to clean all that up and make it sound super present, and then that would be here. Now everything is muted because in this final version we only have one big stereo track of the entire movie. That's the final audio mix output. There is another version which is called stems, dialogue, music, and effects, that you also deliver to the distributor, because sometimes in international versions they want to just pull out the dialogue and dub the film, but they like the effects and the music. Or there might be a licensing issue for a piece of music that needs to be replaced in one territory. While they don't want to have the whole movie in every single audio clip, they want to have split tracks to be able to go in and make changes. They can also make the movie shorter if they needed to. Let's say this is a 90-minute version and on television they want to cut it down to a 60-minute version. It allows them to make changes without having to have the entire project because they have the audio split up. Okay, let's go back to Eddie.
And you can see how there's a lot of dialogue going on. And quite often it's different versions of line readings of each line. And what I will do selectively is mute various ones. In fact, I think you can see some of them grayed out.
He's talking about having different versions of the same dialogue line. We don't quite have that in a documentary. There is a difference because we only have one take. Obviously, in a documentary, you don't redo things normally. But with a feature in an indie world, we would also have different takes. And I would potentially cut different versions into the timeline and disengage or mute certain parts. The one thing I want to point out here is we actually have several mics going on at any given moment. So let's say there's a person talking, they might have a lav and a boom mic, and then they might have a backup of the lav and the boom in the sense that it's mixed slightly lower. Because you could have, let's say, a laugh at the perfect level, and then your person for whatever reason starts screaming, and then if you don't catch it and mix it down in the moment, all the signal would be distorted. So it's good to have a backup track that is a couple of dBs lower, that if suddenly there's a really dynamic shift, something gets really loud, you still have a clean version of it because it hasn't peaked yet. So we do tend to have at least 4 tracks, sometimes even more, whenever we have an interview or even several characters talking.
Fast lane when I pass in the street, bag of money in the past.
This is something that's really interesting and cool, and I would love to adapt it. He gives different characters a different color so he can see how much they own of a scene.
And you can see that I'm using clip colors here to help me work out who is talking. So if I recall, Phoenix was pink and Rooster was that brown color and Hangman was yellow. If you go up to the picture, I think it's slightly clearer on the picture tracks. But you can see there that on the V1 track, you can see when I'm like the exterior shots of jets are green, I think, and then Payback and Fanboy, I think Maverick was blue and Payback and Fanboy, and then Phoenix. I can see at a glance how much coverage of each character I'm using on the timeline and how many exterior shots I'm using.
So it gives him a visual reference of how the scene is paced or who is primarily on screen in a scene, which can be quite helpful to figure out if you, for example, know this scene is from the point of view of Maverick. It would tend to mean maybe they need to have more screen time, this kind of stuff. But there is something else he does with color too. Coloring the odd and even numbers of scenes a different color so that you always have a view on how long a scene is in context of all the other scenes. I think this is quite brilliant.
If you scroll down to the middle of this reel, you'll see the scene, like there's the sailing scene and the scene where, so we've got a dialogue scene there, the green scene. So you'll see, I think that's probably Phoenix and Rooster on the tarmac talking. And then the scene after that is the scene where Maverick gets shouted at by Cyclone. What I like to do is even numbered scenes, I will color green, and odd numbered scenes, I'll color blue. And then when you're looking at the timeline at a glance, you can see the relative lengths of each scene. So when you're judging the pace of the movie, you can see how long each scene is in relative terms to the scene before and after.
How brilliant is that? So you can basically look at an entire act of a movie or the entire movie, and you can kind of figure out where like the big chunks of a movie are, where things slow down, where things speed up. And by doing it with even and uneven numbers, giving them specific colors, you have this sort of checkerboard pattern. I find that quite helpful, and this is definitely something I'm going to think about doing next time. Now, the other thing he's saying is he doesn't do it all the time, because obviously here you see it doesn't happen that way. This is where he has the different characters, exterior shots, character colors. So he plays around with it. It's not like he's sticking to his own rules religiously when it doesn't make sense. He feels like with certain scenes, it makes sense to be by character. With other scenes, it makes sense to give them their own color. Let's look a little bit about how we use color in our reel. And it's quite simple. We have what is kind of the drama stuff. This is kind of a purple color. Anything that is treated, visual effects. This is kind of a pink color. There are some green shots versus that might be a version thing, or it's a different type of treatment. We use this blue for dialogue mostly, and we use green for music. So we do it more like it's representing a certain track and what that nature of that track is, as opposed to characters or even an odd scene numbers. Okay, and then finally, things that I want to point out that are quite interesting is he talks about keyframes, using keyframes quite a bit. And what that is he's creating kind of a rubber band, is what we call that, of the actual waveform of the audio. He's mixing it up and down, as opposed to maybe using a filter that does some auto ducking or some compressing or some noise gate to level out and make everything consistent.
I use a lot of keyframes. So right there, you can see on the music track, It says won't get fooled again there. It says from The Who. Now, this is an edited version of the track from Cecile Tornasak, our music editor. And when I'm working with the music to kind of get it working with the film, sometimes I'll have the dialogue and the effects running. If there was an old music track there, I'll mute it and then I'll enable the new track and then I'll mix it in with all the keyframes.
And I actually am of that same philosophy to prefer doing it manually, and I prefer using keyframes because it just gets me the best results. I decide how to level out the audio levels and I can tweak it when it gets better. But listen to what he has to say.
That's just how I prefer to do it. Some other editors do it a different way, but I really like using keyframes because you know that they're definitely going to work. Because if you use crossfades, sometimes you'll accidentally delete them or the levels will change and you won't know. Whereas with keyframes, you can definitely see what everything's doing. And you'll see there's a lot of keyframes in the dialogue tracks. Like when I'm working on dialogue scenes, I really work on the dialogue a lot to make it sound smooth.
And this is quite common with editors, that they actually do a lot of sound work. And the reason being is when you screen this to a director and the audio is off, like the levels are off or it's rough, there's like audio pops in there, it sounds uneven, you're just gonna get more notes. And it's gonna be harder for the director to really judge a scene for what it is. So I always work the audio that feels like it's ready to screen. That doesn't mean that I'm doing the job of an audio mixer or a sound editor. They're going to do their own thing and they're going to do what they think is right, and they're going to bring more creativity and more of what they do well. When I'm sitting with a director and screen a scene, I need to make it sound as if it's ready to screen, because even directors cannot judge a scene when it's rough, when it just feels like a rough cut. It has to feel smooth. If audio sounds bad, it's just gonna pull you away from the film. If something is too loud, it's gonna be a pain in your ear. If something is too quiet and you can't hear it, you're gonna have to work harder to understand. And you're not gonna be as much engaged, you're gonna be more frustrated. And if you look at any of my scenes that I cut, you will see that I do quite a bit of working with keyframes right here. I mix the audio all by myself to make sure everything is smooth, everything works out, it's clean. Okay, good. So these are the key points that I want to point out. First of all, we work in reels. It makes it more manageable, more contained. It's easier to delegate things. People can work on the movie at different spots. Very important. We organize our tracks very consistently with the sort of camera originals or the production tracks being the video layer 1 and then everything else on top. And with the audio as well, we kind of have a pattern where we put the dialogue first, then the effects and the music. And we have a good chunk of tracks available for all of that. And in the original cutting, you might have 30, 40, 50 audio tracks. And then when you clean everything up at the end, it's gonna get more condensed. But yeah, overall, you can tell how busy things get. And this is what Eddie also says. It's really important to be organized because there's so much stuff happening in your timeline and you don't want it to be confusing at any given moment. You want some clarity.
You can see how busy the timeline is for these aerial sequences. It was a real challenge to keep track of everything. And, you know, the timeline gets very, very busy. Even when you're looking at a 20-minute sequence, it's still very tight. So that's it, guys.
So very nice. I'm gonna link his video below so you can watch his entire tour as well. Overall, you can tell it's not that different from how we do it on these smaller films. The more organized you are, the easier it is for you to work with other departments, and it helps you actually optimize the way how you cut your scene so that you do your best work. Let me know how you do it. If you have some ideas or hacks how you organize differently in your timeline, I'd be very curious to pick up some of those tips. And that's really cool when you see other editors work at any level, when they figured out some stuff that maybe you do differently, and it could really help you to be on top of it in a way how they do it. Thanks so much for watching. Happy editing and cheers.